Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Canada has the longest coastline of any country in the world. For Canadians who live on the coast, there is a powerful pull and connection to the natural world. It's our identity, it's our livelihoods, it's our life. Canadians are passionate about the health of the ocean. We watch and care about everything that happens on our shores, in coastal waters, and in offshore areas. And Canadians have been calling for greater protections and the capacity to monitor and enforce those protections. Bill C-55 is our government's legislation to protect marine ecosystems and support the health of our oceans, in concert with forthcoming legislation under the Navigation Protection Act, Fisheries Act, and the Environmental Assessment Review. Marine protected areas are a way to protect the ocean. These special areas seek to balance conservation and protection with sustainable use of our marine resources. They are living networks where marine species are born, grow, reproduce, thrive. It's by protecting these systems that we can protect the oceans and the maritime resources on which many Canadians depend. Bill C-55 will enable the government to establish marine protected areas expeditiously, protecting critical and unique areas of our Canadian oceans as soon as within the next 24 months. These amendments will ensure that when needed, an interim protection marine protected area can be put in place so that new activities that could risk further harm to ocean ecosystems, habitat, or marine life would not be allowed to occur in these protected zones. Interim protection offered by the new provisions in the Oceans Act is an important part of ensuring that Canadians who depend on fishing, whether for shellfish, finfish, or other marine organisms, can count on their livelihoods being protected over the long term. By establishing protection for critical marine habitats, we protect the marine resources we rely upon. A significant aspect of Bill C-55 is to strengthen the law and to lay penalties. We're ensuring that enforcement officers will have the power to maintain the protected status of these marine protected areas. Under these proposed changes, the Minister will have the authority to designate individuals as enforcement officers. For example, Indigenous people currently working as guardian watchmen on the North Pacific coast, or members of provincial or local law enforcement could be designated the authority to enforce the Oceans Act within their waters. This provision will allow for greater collaboration with Indigenous organizations and will distribute enforcement responsibilities to our partners. On the ground, this will make a significant difference to citizens who have been begging for this kind of proper attention and collaboration. The amendments enable enforcement officers to make far better use of technology during an investigation. For example, an enforcement officer will be able to require anyone being investigated to produce documents or electronic data, to examine the documents electronically and require that access to these devices be granted. It's hard to believe we're talking about this in 2017, so this is really important that we get with the times. These new contemporary powers are similar to those found in the Fisheries Act. The powers of enforcement officers have not only been strengthened, the amendments and additions proposed in Bill C-55 are in line with the powers of environmental protection officers under other statutes. Similar powers are found in the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. The proposed changes will better match those proposed under other natural resource laws. For example, the obligation to provide assistance to enforcement officers has been added to the Oceans Act. Under this new power, those involved will be required to provide reasonable assistance to enforcement officers in an inspection. The officer will also be able to examine and take samples and to seize all objects that she or he has reasonable grounds to believe were obtained through the commission of an offence under the Act. Also, rights of passage have been added to the Oceans Act. When an enforcement officer needs to go through private property to inspect an area that couldn't otherwise be accessed, the officer will now have the right to walk through private property to gain access to an area of the ocean that is being inspected, like a pier, a fishing vessel, or fishing apparatus. Ships that need to be inspected may now be lawfully directed or detained to any place in Canadian waters. An officer will have the authority to require this if they have reasonable grounds to believe that the ship or a person on board that ship has committed an offence related to the Oceans Act. Similar powers can be found in the Canadian Environmental Protection Act of 1999 and the Antarctic Environmental Protection Act. A new provision has also been added to the Oceans Act where the legal owner of objects seized, locked up, abandoned, or confiscated, and persons entitled to possession of them are jointly and severally liable for the costs incurred by the government, an inspection, a seizure, a capital property forfeiture, or a disposition. An offence under the Oceans Act can now also result in charges under other applicable Canadian legislation, such as the Fisheries Act or the Species at Risk Act. For example, fisheries closures are also imposed in marine protected areas. A violation of such closures could expose a fisher to charges laid under the Fisheries Act, as well as charges for not respecting a prohibition in marine protected areas. Madam Speaker, moving to the fines and punishments proposed under Bill C-55 to create greater certainty and administrative consistency. Under the current 20-year-old Oceans Act, contravention of the existing prohibitions could carry fines of up to $100,000 for an offence punishable on summary conviction, or $500,000 for an indictable offence. Penalties or punishment can vary depending on the offence and can include the imposition of monetary fines, license suspension, prohibition orders, and creative sentencing such as community service. Bill C-55 seeks to align fines with those of other acts. The amount of the fine imposed on an individual will increase to between $200,000 to $300,000 for an offence punishable on summary conviction, and from $500,000 to $1 million for a criminal offence. The bill also proposes to allow the courts to impose fines on corporations and ships. This is a measure that is consistent with other environmental laws, including the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And we're adding new factors that the courts will be able to take into account when they determine the fine that will be imposed on a person, corporation, or ship if they are found guilty. These are: was the offence a continuation of an offence? Did the offender do this numerous times or over several days, weeks, or months? Was this a second or subsequent offence? Was the offender found guilty of having committed another offence in the past? Were there any aggravating factors, such as having committed the offence despite having been warned by an enforcement officer not to start or to continue the activity? The courts will also be able to take into account such matters as small revenue corporation status and the liability of directors, masters, owners, officers, agents, and mandataries. The bill also provides a possibility of leniency under the due diligence defence. This means that if someone is accused of an offence, they can explain to a court that they were prudent and reasonable in the particular circumstances of the offence. There will also be more court orders in the bill, such as the ability to charge an amount in order to monitor environmental effects, to promote the conservation and protection of marine protected areas, to conduct research, to assist a group for their work on the marine protected areas, or to support an educational institution. Bill C-55 is an important step toward providing Canada's oceans with the protection that Canadians expect and have been asking for. And for me, as a representative of West Vancouver Sunshine Coast Sea to Sky country, this is an important step. It's a step toward protecting the livelihoods of many Canadians as well. I look forward to continuing to participate in the protection of Canada's marine ecosystems from coast to coast to coast. Thank you very much.